something in you stopped scrolling. Maybe it was a word in the title. Maybe it was a feeling you have been carrying around for months. That quiet, persistent sense that something is just slightly off. That you are so close to the life you actually want, and yet somehow it keeps staying just out of reach. Like a door you can see clearly, but cannot quite figure out how to open. Whatever brought you here, I want you to know something before we go any further. You are not broken. You have never been broken, and the fact that things have not clicked into place yet is not evidence of a flaw in you. It is evidence of something far more interesting and far more fixable. You were simply never given the full map. Most of us were handed a fragment of it and told it was the whole thing. Think about what you were taught about creating the life you want. Think positive. Visualize clearly. Believe it, and it will come. Say it out loud. Write it down. Feel it as if it is already real. And maybe some of it worked, sometimes partially, unpredictably. And maybe more often than not, you did everything exactly right. Followed every instruction, repeated every affirmation, held the vision as clearly as you could, and still watched the thing you wanted stay exactly where it was, just out of reach. And when that happened, when the technique failed and the vision board collected dust and the affirmations stopped feeling true no matter how many times you said them, the only explanation that made sense was the one that landed the hardest. Something is wrong with me. I need you to hear this directly. That was never the truth. What was wrong was the map. What you were given was a single street pulled out of an entire city grid and handed to you as though it contained every road you would ever need. And when you got lost, which was inevitable, you blamed your sense of direction instead of the map. This book is the rest of the map. Not a new technique, not a better affirmation, not a more detailed visualization practice. What you're going to walk through here is the actual architecture, the foundational structure that every serious tradition of conscious creation, from the ancient Vedic sages to the Hermetic masters, understood and worked with deliberately, and that the modern personal development world has almost entirely discarded in favor of content that fits on a caption and sells better than the truth. By the time you finish this book, you're going to understand 4 things that most people who spend years studying manifestation never actually grasp. You're going to understand why the signal you are broadcasting to the world is almost never the one you think you are sending, and what is actually generating the frequency your life is currently organized around. You are going to understand why the people in your life, especially the ones who challenge you most, are not obstacles to your growth, but precise, consistent, almost uncannily accurate maps of exactly where your growth is currently located. You're going to understand why getting more of what you want almost always requires releasing something first, and why the thing you are most reluctant to release is almost always the exact thing standing between you and what you say you want. And you are going to understand why the most powerful thing you can do with a new intention is, in many cases, to say absolutely nothing about it to anyone. And why the traditions that understood creation most deeply treated silence not as an absence, but as the most active and protective force available to a person building something real. These are not soft ideas. These are not inspirational concepts dressed up in ancient language to make them sound more authoritative than they are. These are laws, consistent, observable, tested across thousands of years by traditions that had nothing to gain from teaching something that did not actually work. And they are laws that apply directly to your life right now, exactly as it is. You did not find this by accident. Some part of you has been ready for this for longer than you probably realize. That part recognized something the moment you pressed play, something that felt true before a single word had been explained. Let's honor that recognition by going all the way in. Chapter 1, The Law of Vibration, What You Are Actually Sending. Let's start with the word that has been doing the most damage: attraction. Say it out loud if you want. Notice what image it creates in your mind. Something pulling something toward it, right? A force reaching out across space, grabbing what it wants, dragging it in. A magnet, a gravitational pull. Desire as a kind of force field strong enough to bend reality toward you if you generate enough of it. That image is the source of almost every frustration you have ever had with this work, because that is not how any of this actually operates. The traditions that first articulated what we now loosely call the law of attraction, the Hermetic schools, the Vedic traditions, the early mystery teachings, never described it as a pulling force. They described it as a matching force. And that distinction, which sounds subtle on the surface, changes absolutely everything about how you work with it. A magnet pulls. It extends force outward and drags something toward it that was previously separate from it. But the field you are actually operating within does not work like a magnet. It works more like a radio tower. You are not reaching out and pulling things toward you. You are broadcasting constantly, involuntarily, in every waking moment, and the world around you is organizing itself in response to the frequency of that broadcast. The difference between those two models is not just philosophical. It is immediately, practically significant, because if you believe you are a magnet, then when the thing you want does not arrive, the logical response is to pull harder, want more intensely, visualize more vividly, generate more force. And if that still does not work, the only conclusion available is that your force is not strong enough, which is simply another way of saying something is wrong with me. But if you understand that you are a broadcast tower, the question shifts entirely. The question is no longer, how do I pull this harder? The question is, what frequency am I actually transmitting? And that question, that single, honest, slightly uncomfortable question, is the one this entire chapter is built around. The signal beneath the signal here is the piece of this law that almost never gets taught. And I want to be direct about it because I think it is the most important thing in this entire book. The frequency you are broadcasting is not primarily generated by what you say you want. It is generated by what you actually believe about your relationship to having it. Read that again, slowly, because everything else in this chapter depends on understanding it fully. You can want something with complete sincerity. You can visualize it in precise, vivid detail every morning before you get out of bed. You can write it on sticky notes and paste them on every mirror in your house. You can repeat the affirmation until the words feel engraved in your mind. And if the belief running underneath all of that, the one that has been operating mostly in the background, mostly unnoticed, mostly unquestioned for years, is telling a different story, it is the story underneath that the field is actually responding to, not the words on top, the frequency underneath. Let me make this as concrete as possible, because abstract concepts are easy to agree with and hard to actually use. Imagine two people sitting side by side. Both of them are working toward financial freedom. Both of them meditate every morning. Both of them have a vision board. Both of them read the same books, listen to the same podcasts, say essentially the same things when someone asks what they are working toward. But underneath all of that, in the place where the real signal lives, they are broadcasting two entirely different things. The first person has a quiet, persistent hum running through nearly everything they do. It sounds like, I have never really had enough. I have always had to fight for it. The people who get wealthy easily are different from me in some fundamental way that I cannot quite name but can always feel. They do not say this out loud. They would probably deny it if you asked directly. But it is there, running in the background, shaping every decision, every opportunity they notice or ignore, every risk they take or avoid. The second person has a different hum. It sounds like, I have managed money well when I had it. I have figured out hard things before. More is simply the next natural step, not a leap into some other person's life, but a natural extension of a trajectory I am already on. They are not naive about the work required. They are simply not broadcasting a frequency of scarcity underneath a surface of abundance language. Both people are saying the same words. Both are doing the same practices, but they are not transmitting the same signal. And the field, which responds with extraordinary precision to what is actually present rather than what is being performed, will respond to them differently. This is not a punishing universe playing favorites. This is physics applied to the dimension of belief. The frequency that is actually present is the one that actually matters. And the frequency that is actually present is almost never the one being loudly performed on the surface. The ancient teaching held something that I find both sobering and, in its own way, deeply freeing. A soul cannot outspeak its own belief. You can say the affirmation 10,000 times. If the frequency underneath the affirmation is still scarcity, still unworthiness, still the old inherited story running on a loop you have never once examined, the field will respond to the frequency that is genuinely present, not the one being carefully layered on top of it. This is not punishment. This is precision. The field does not judge the gap between what you are saying and what you actually believe. It simply, faithfully, without exception, reflects the truer of the two signals back to you. Why your unwanted patterns are not bad luck. Now, I want to sit with that for a moment, because what I just described has a very specific implication that most people, understandably, resist when they first encounter it. If the field is responding to the deeper frequency rather than the surface-level performance, then every persistent, unwanted pattern in your life is not evidence of bad luck or poor timing or an indifferent universe. It is a readout. The relationship dynamic that keeps repeating itself with different people wearing what is essentially the same face. The financial ceiling that seems to reappear no matter how much momentum you build toward breaking through it. The recognition that keeps arriving almost but not quite, close enough to feel tantalizing, far enough away to stay frustrating. The health pattern you have addressed 100 different ways and somehow not fundamentally shifted. These are not random. They are not cosmically unfair. They are not proof that you are doing it wrong or that this whole framework is broken. They are the field faithfully, precisely, without any malice whatsoever, reflecting back a frequency that has never actually changed, even while the words layered on top of it have changed dozens of times. I know that is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be. The ancient teachers never advertised this as comfortable knowledge. They advertised it as useful knowledge, which is a different thing entirely, and in the long run, a far more valuable one. Because the moment you understand that a persistent pattern is a readout rather than a punishment, something shifts. The external circumstance stops being the thing you are fighting. Your attention moves to the only place where the pattern can actually change, the belief sitting underneath it. And that is where the real work begins. The two layers beneath every desire. The teachers who understood this law most deeply, the ones who worked with it across entire lifetimes of careful observation, describe two specific layers sitting beneath every conscious desire. And understanding both of them is, in my experience, what separates the people who seem to create with almost effortless consistency from the people who work extraordinarily hard and receive very little in return. The first layer is the belief about worthiness. Not worthiness in the abstract philosophical sense. Not some grand existential question about human value, but the very specific, very personal, almost embarrassingly quiet question of, do I actually believe that I, specifically, with my particular history, my specific mistakes, my particular collection of old wounds and inherited stories, am someone this is allowed to happen to? Most people have never asked themselves that question directly, never sat down with it, looked it in the eye, and waited for an honest answer. They have simply absorbed a response to it somewhere along the way, usually very early in life, usually from the people who shaped their earliest understanding of what they were capable of and what they were entitled to hope for, and have been operating from that absorbed answer ever since, without ever bringing it into conscious view. The second layer is the belief about safety. This one tends to be subtler, and in many cases it is even more powerful than the worthiness layer, because it operates in a part of the self that the conscious mind rarely visits. The safety question is this: does some part of you associate getting what you want with a kind of danger? For some people, success was punished early in life. Standing out attracted criticism, resentment, consequences. Some deep layer of the self learned that being visible is dangerous, that drawing attention to yourself leads to pain, and has been quietly, consistently working to prevent visibility ever since, even while the conscious mind is asking for recognition and expansion. For others, love was withdrawn the moment they needed too much of it. So some deep layer learned that receiving, really fully, openly receiving, is the setup for an eventual loss. Something in them reaches for what they want and simultaneously braces for the moment it gets taken away, which means they never quite fully arrive in the having of it. The conscious mind does not choose to sabotage a desire. It would be horrified by the suggestion. But if a part of the self has learned, through real, lived, painful experience, that having this particular thing leads eventually to this particular kind of pain, that part will work against the conscious desire with extraordinary, quiet efficiency, not out of malice, out of protection. This is why willpower alone so rarely resolves a stuck pattern. Willpower operates at the level of the conscious request, but the frequency being broadcast is coming from these two deeper layers, worthiness and safety, that exist well below the level where willpower can reach. No amount of forcing the conscious mind to repeat a positive sentence will override a belief that is operating several layers beneath the level where sentences live. What actually shifts the signal? If everything I have just described sounds like it demands years of intensive therapy, before you are allowed to try again, I want to reassure you directly. It does not. What it demands is simpler than that and more immediately available. It begins with something I am going to call witnessing, and it is a practice we will return to in every chapter of this book, because it is, in my experience and in the understanding of every tradition that has worked with these laws seriously, the foundational act from which all real change actually emerges. The premise of witnessing is this: you cannot shift a belief you have never looked at directly. Most people spend their entire lives being run by beliefs about worthiness and safety that they have never once examined, not because they are lazy or unspiritually evolved, but because examining those beliefs requires a specific kind of honesty that the mind, left entirely to its own devices, will avoid at almost any cost. It is far more comfortable to locate the problem outside of yourself, in the market, in the timing, in the behavior of other people, in some vague cosmic unfairness, than it is to sit quietly with the following question and actually wait for an honest answer. What do I actually believe is true about whether I am allowed to have this? The practice is not complicated, though I will warn you honestly, it is rarely comfortable, at least not at first. Take the specific thing you want and have not yet received. Sit with it quietly, without rushing past the discomfort, and ask yourself, as honestly as you can manage, underneath the wanting, underneath the hope, and the visualization and the affirmation, what do I actually expect to happen? Not what do I hope? Not what do I want? What do I, if I am genuinely quietly honest with myself, expect? The gap between the hope and the expectation is almost always where the real frequency is hiding. And in my experience, it is almost always larger than people initially assume. There is often a significant distance between what a person sincerely wants and what they actually, at some quiet level below the words, believe is coming. Once you can see that gap clearly, once you can hold the underlying belief in your conscious view without immediately collapsing into shame about how long it has been running or how much damage it may have. Done. Something remarkable becomes available. You cannot force a belief to change through sheer repetition, but you can offer it evidence, small, real, undeniable evidence gathered deliberately and specifically that the old story is no longer entirely true. Not affirmations recited without genuine feeling behind them. Actual lived proof, collected on purpose, that contradicts the inherited belief in ways too specific and too real to be dismissed. This is slower than a caption promises. It requires patience and honest attention in a world that rewards the opposite of both. But it is also, as far as I have ever been able to find, the only version of this work that reliably produces lasting results rather than temporary shifts that eventually collapse back into the old pattern. The part the ancient teachers cared most about. There is a final piece of this chapter that I want to give particular attention to because it is the piece that the modern retelling of this law has most completely abandoned, and because losing it has done, I think, more damage than almost anything else in the personal development world. The ancient teachers who worked with this law most seriously were not primarily focused on whether you received the specific object of your desire. They were concerned with something they considered far more fundamental: congruence. They were asking whether the signal you were broadcasting was an honest, aligned expression of who you actually are, underneath the layers of fear and inherited belief and borrowed story that accumulate over a lifetime. When that congruence is genuinely present, when what you are broadcasting actually matches what you deeply, truly are, rather than what you have been performing, the specific outcome tends to arrive almost as a side effect, not as the main event, as a natural consequence of a frequency that is no longer fighting itself. I know that sounds abstract until you have experienced it directly. But here is what people who do this work honestly report again and again, with a consistency that I find genuinely remarkable. The moment they stopped focusing relentlessly on the object and started genuinely addressing the belief running underneath it, the object stopped feeling so urgently, desperately necessary. The need for it to arrive as proof that they were doing something right began to loosen. And very often, not always, but very often, that is precisely the moment it arrived. Not because detachment is a clever trick for making the universe cooperate, but because a frequency that is no longer performing desire on top of a belief that contradicts that desire is finally, genuinely, cleanly doing one thing instead of two contradictory things simultaneously. And that clarity of signal is something the field can actually respond to. You are not behind. You have not failed at this. You were simply given a fragment of a much larger architecture and told it was the whole building. In the next chapter, we turn to the second piece of that architecture and to a law that explains something you have almost certainly felt but may never have had precise language for: why the people around you, especially the ones who challenge you most consistently and most painfully, are not obstacles to your growth, but some of the most accurate maps of it you will ever encounter. Chapter 2. The Law of Reflection. What the people around you are actually showing you. There is a moment almost everyone has experienced and almost no one has fully understood. You encounter someone, sometimes a stranger, sometimes someone who has been in your life for years, and something in you reacts before your conscious mind has time to construct an explanation for why. It might be an irritation that feels disproportionately sharp relative to whatever small thing they actually did. It might be a pull toward them that feels stronger than the amount of time you have known each other should reasonably account for. It might be a flash of judgment, arriving so quickly and so completely that it surprises even you. Most people move past these moments without a second look. They attribute them to personality, to chemistry, to simply liking or not liking someone the way weather simply happens to be one thing or another on a given day, something external occurring outside of them, largely unrelated to anything happening within. But the traditions that understood the architecture of reality most deeply saw these moments very differently. They understood them as information, precise, consistent, extraordinarily reliable information about the parts of yourself that have not yet been fully brought into conscious view. This is the law of reflection, and it is in many ways the most intimate law in this entire book, which is precisely why it is also the most uncomfortable, and why most people, when they first encounter it, find at least a dozen reasons to believe it applies to everyone except them. It asks you to consider something that most of us spend significant energy avoiding, that the outer world, and specifically the people in it, are not simply happening to you. They are showing you something, constantly, faithfully, whether you are ready to see it or not. The mirror that never takes a day off, the principle beneath this law, appears with remarkable consistency across traditions that had little direct contact with each other, which is itself worth noting. The Hermetic teachers articulated it through what they called the law of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. The inner world and the outer world are not two separate domains with a wall between them. They are two expressions of a single pattern continuously shaping each other. The Vedic tradition arrived at something strikingly similar through its understanding of perception itself. The idea that what appears before us in form is deeply, inextricably shaped by the consciousness that is doing the perceiving. Different cultures, different language, different cosmological frameworks, same underlying observation. The world outside of you is not a neutral, objective stage on which your life simply unfolds. It is, at least in part, a responsive surface, arranging itself in relationship to what is happening within you, reflecting it back to you through the experiences you attract and the reactions those experiences produce. Now, before we go any further, I want to be precise about something because this law is frequently misunderstood in a way that makes it useless and occasionally harmful. The law of reflection is not saying that you are authoring every action of every person around you. It is not claiming that other people are simply projections with no independent existence. The difficult colleague who spoke over you in that meeting has their own history, their own unresolved material, their own reasons for behaving the way they behave that have absolutely nothing to do with you. What the law is pointing to is something more specific and more immediately useful than that. It is the observation that what you notice, what affects you, what you are drawn toward or repelled by with unusual intensity, is rarely random. It is filtered through you, and that filter, the specific things that land hard and the things that slide off without leaving a mark, is telling you something true about your own interior landscape, whether the person in front of you had any intention of revealing anything at all. The real signal. Disproportionate charge. To make this immediately practical, I want to introduce a specific concept that will reframe the way you relate to your own reactions for the rest of your life. The concept is charge. Not every reaction to another person carries the kind of information this law is pointing to. If someone cuts in front of you in line and you feel a brief flash of annoyance that passes within 2 minutes, that is simply a normal human response to a mildly irritating situation. It does not require excavation. It does not need to become a profound self-inquiry session. It is just Tuesday. The law of reflection becomes relevant specifically when the reaction is disproportionate, when it is significantly larger than the triggering event warrants, when it lingers far longer than the situation reasonably justifies, when it keeps returning with different people wearing what is essentially the same costume, playing what is essentially the same role in your life over and over. This disproportion, this excess of charge relative to the actual size of what triggered it, is the specific signature the ancient traditions taught their students to pay attention to. A small event producing a small reaction is life. A small event producing a large, persistent, lingering reaction is a mirror. Something in that moment has made contact with a nerve that was already exposed long before the other person arrived. A nerve that has been waiting, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, to be pressed so that you would finally have to notice it is there. Let me give you a concrete example that I think most people will recognize in some form. Imagine someone in your life, a colleague, an acquaintance, someone you encounter with some regularity, whose confidence you find yourself reacting to with a sharpness that surprises you. Maybe you describe it to yourself as arrogance. Maybe you feel a flash of contempt when they speak about themselves with ease. Maybe their willingness to take up space in a room generates something in you that is difficult to name and difficult to set down after the fact. The surface reading of this reaction is simple. They are arrogant, and you are responding to genuine arrogance. But here is what the ancient teaching would ask you to do instead of accepting that surface reading. Get curious about the charge itself. Specifically, ask this: where in your own history was confidence like that? That easy, unashamed, space-taking confidence punished, mocked, made to feel dangerous, or simply quietly removed from the list of things you were allowed to be? Where did you learn, likely very early, from people whose opinions of you felt like survival-level information, that presenting yourself with that kind of ease was not safe for you? That it would attract criticism, resentment, consequences you could not afford? The contempt you feel towards someone else's confidence is very often, not always, but very often, a version of grief you have never fully allowed yourself to feel about your own. The part of you that was taught to stay small. The confidence you learned long ago to keep hidden or to abandon entirely in order to stay safe or stay loved. This is, I will be honest with you, not comfortable to sit with. The mind resists this reframe strongly and creatively. It is far easier and far more immediately satisfying to conclude that the other person is simply arrogant and the problem lives entirely in them than it is to turn the lens back on yourself and ask what in you is being illuminated by your reaction to them. But the discomfort is not a sign that the reframe is wrong. In my experience, it is almost always a sign that it is right. The other direction, what you admire. There is something important I want to add here, because most discussions of shadow work and reflection focus exclusively on the negative end. What irritates you, what you judge, what you find contemptible in others, and stop there. And stopping there is a mistake that leaves half the picture invisible. The law of reflection applies with equal force in the opposite direction. When you encounter someone and feel an admiration that is disproportionate, an almost magnetic pull toward a quality they carry, an intensity of inspiration that feels stronger than a brief encounter should reasonably produce, that is also a mirror. That is also information. That is the field directing your attention towards something that lives within you as genuine capacity, but has never been given the conditions it needed to develop or emerge. The person whose creativity stops you cold every time you encounter their work. The colleague whose groundedness in a room of chaos you find yourself quietly studying, trying to understand how they do it. The friend whose willingness to say the true, uncomfortable thing out loud in situations where everyone else stays carefully quiet generates something in you that feels like admiration, but also, underneath it, like a kind of longing. According to this law, you are not simply admiring something external and unreachable. You are recognizing something that already exists within you, dormant perhaps, or buried under years of disuse or discouragement, or simply the absence of anyone who ever pointed at it and said that. That thing you just did. More of that. The intensity of the admiration is the field's way of saying, here, this is yours. It has been waiting for permission. This reframes something that most people experience as inspiration but rarely examine closely enough to actually use. The teacher or creator or human being you cannot stop thinking about is not someone whose gifts exist in a dimension you can never access. They are, in this framework, a living demonstration of something you are already carrying, something that has simply never been given the right conditions, the right encouragement, the right conscious attention to grow into its full form. That is worth sitting with, especially if you have spent time wishing you could do what someone else does rather than asking yourself what part of you already knows how. The two traps to avoid. There are two specific ways people tend to mishandle this teaching once they encounter it, and I want to name them directly before we go any further, because both of them, if left unexamined, will quietly neutralize the value of everything in this chapter. The first trap is blame, either aimed outward or inward. Outward blame sounds like their behavior caused my reaction, so the problem is entirely theirs, and there is nothing here for me to examine. This misses the teaching completely. The other person's behavior is real. In many cases, it is genuinely inappropriate, hurtful, or wrong. Nothing in this framework asks you to excuse harm, to pretend difficult behavior did not occur, or to remain in situations that are actively damaging to you. But even where the other person's behavior is legitimately problematic, even where they genuinely did something worth addressing, your specific reaction, the particular size and shape and texture and duration of your charge, still belongs to you. It still carries information about you, and it still deserves your honest attention, rather than being entirely outsourced to what they did. Inward blame is the mirror image of this mistake, and in some ways, it does more damage. It sounds like, if I am reacting this strongly, it must mean I am secretly the very thing I am judging in them, and I should be ashamed. That is not what this teaching says. Recognizing that someone's ease in the world touches an old wound about your own confidence does not mean you are secretly overconfident or that the wound deserved to happen. It means a part of you has something to reclaim, something worth gently, patiently attending to. Shame shuts this process down immediately and completely. Curiosity is the only posture that allows the mirror to actually do its work. The second trap is spiritual bypassing, and it is worth naming carefully because it tends to disguise itself as sophistication. Bypassing sounds like, oh, this person is just a mirror for me, so what they did does not really matter. Or, I understand the law of reflection now, so I do not need to actually feel the hurt underneath the insight. The insight does not erase the feeling. The anger, the grief, the envy, the admiration, all of it is real. All of it deserves to be fully felt, not stepped around with a spiritual concept used as an escape hatch. The mirror is only genuinely useful after you have actually let yourself experience what it is reflecting. Jumping to the concept before actually feeling the feeling simply buries the material one layer deeper, in a container now conveniently labeled spiritually understood, which paradoxically makes it harder to reach the next time it surfaces. Feel first, understand second. That is the order that actually works. How to work with this law? Practically, the practice here builds directly on the witnessing practice from the previous chapter, but it adds a specific step that turns it from a general orientation into a precise and repeatable tool. The next time you notice a reaction to another person that feels larger than the moment warrants, whether it moves toward contempt or toward intense admiration, Do not act on it immediately. Do not explain it away. Pause with it for a moment and ask yourself two questions in sequence. The first question, what specifically am I reacting to? Not the general impression, not, I just don't like them. The specific quality, their confidence, their coldness, their ease with receiving attention without appearing to feel guilty about it, their refusal to apologize for taking up space. Name it as precisely as you possibly can, because the precision of the naming is where the value lives. Once you have named it as precisely as you can, ask the second question. This is the one that actually activates the law. Where in my own life have I learned that this specific quality was dangerous, shameful, unavailable, or forbidden to me? You may not get an immediate answer. That is fine and expected. The question itself begins loosening something that may have been held in place for a very long time. Sometimes since early childhood, sometimes since a single defining moment you have not thought about in years. What you are not looking for is blame, not toward them, not toward yourself. What you're looking for is recognition, the felt sense of, oh, there it is, that is mine, that is old, that has been here a long time, waiting to be seen. That recognition, held with the same non-judgmental witnessing we discussed in Chapter 1, begins to metabolize material that has often been sitting untouched for years. You do not need to resolve it completely in a single sitting. You do not need to achieve some dramatic catharsis in order for the process to be genuinely working. You simply need to stop mistaking the mirror for the problem and start treating it for what it has always been, a map drawn by your own interior life, showing you precisely where the next piece of your own wholeness is currently waiting to be reclaimed. The quiet, extraordinary promise. There is something embedded in this law that I find quietly extraordinary. Something that reframes not just individual relationships, but your entire experience of the people around you. If the world is genuinely reflecting you back to yourself, with this degree of consistency and precision, then no one you encounter, not the difficult colleague, not the inspiring teacher, not the family member whose specific presence still produces a particular feeling in you decades later, is fully separate from your own becoming. Every person who provokes a disproportionate reaction in you is, in this framework, participating in your evolution, whether they know it or not, whether they intended to or not. Whether they would be horrified or honored by that description, this does not mean every relationship is meant to be kept. Some mirrors deliver their message once, and the contract is complete. Not every person who shows you something important is meant to remain in your life indefinitely. But it does mean that the charge itself, wherever it appears, in whatever form, is never simply noise. It is always, without exception, pointing toward something true, something that has been patiently, quietly waiting for you to finally turn and look directly at it. In the next chapter, we turn to a law that most modern personal development content avoids almost entirely, because it asks something that visualization and affirmation never do. It asks you to give something up, and it turns out that what you are most reluctant to release is almost always exactly what is most directly standing between where you are and where you say you want to be. Chapter 3. The Law of Sacrifice. What you actually have to let go. There is a sentence that appears in some form in nearly every serious tradition that has ever attempted to describe how creation actually works. And it is a sentence the modern manifestation world has conspired to avoid repeating because it does not sell nearly as effectively as the alternative. The sentence is this: nothing new enters a life without something old being released to make room for it. This is the law of sacrifice. And before we go any further, I want to dismantle the misunderstanding that the word itself almost inevitably produces, because if we carry that misunderstanding into this chapter, we will miss the entire teaching. When most people hear the word sacrifice, they picture loss. They picture giving up something precious, something beloved, something that costs them real effort to build, as a kind of toll paid to a universe that demands suffering as proof of devotion, pain as the price of receiving, deprivation as the language the cosmos requires. That is not what this law is describing. It never was. The ancient teachers who worked with this principle were not describing suffering. They were describing exchange. And exchange, properly understood, is one of the most fundamental and most elegant mechanics in the entire structure of how reality operates. What sacrifice actually means? The word itself, if you trace it back to its root, does not mean loss. It means to make sacred, not to suffer, not to be diminished, to consciously, deliberately set something apart and offer it in service of something greater. The Vedic tradition understood this with particular depth through the concept of yajna, a sacred exchange rooted not in deprivation, but in the understanding that everything at every level operates through continuous circulation. Energy given, energy received, nothing hoarded indefinitely in a closed system that only takes and never returns. Nothing created from nothing. This is not a poetic metaphor borrowed loosely from ritual for inspirational purposes. It is a precise description of how energy behaves at every observable level of existence. Look at any natural system closely enough, and you will find the same pattern. The tree does not grow without the seed ceasing to be a seed. The day does not arrive without the night releasing its hold. The breath that fills your lungs only becomes possible because the previous breath was completely released. Nothing accumulates without something being converted. Nothing new forms without something old transforming. The Hermetic tradition captured a related principle through what it called the law of perpetual transmutation. Nothing in the universe is ever destroyed. It is only ever converted from one form into another. Sacrifice, understood through this lens, is not loss in any final sense. It is transformation. The conscious, deliberate choice to convert energy currently locked in one form into a form that is capable of receiving what you are asking to create. Why this law got removed from the teaching. It is worth pausing to understand specifically why this law is almost entirely absent from mainstream manifestation content, because the reason illuminates something important about why so many sincere, well-intentioned people have spent years practicing these techniques without producing the results they were promised. A teaching that says you can have anything you want simply by aligning your thoughts with it correctly is understandably more appealing to package, more comfortable to hear, and vastly easier to sell than a teaching that says you can have what you want. But only once you have consciously released whatever is currently occupying the space that thing needs in order to exist. The first version asks nothing of you except belief and a willingness to practice visualization. The second version asks something considerably more demanding. It asks for genuine honesty about what you are holding on to. And then this is the part that makes it genuinely difficult. It asks for the willingness to let go before the universe has handed you any proof that the exchange will be worth it. This is precisely why so many people who practice visualization and affirmation with complete sincerity still find themselves stuck in patterns they cannot break. They are asking the field for something new while simultaneously, often entirely unconsciously, refusing to release the old thing that is occupying the space the new thing needs in order to arrive. They are asking for a larger container while gripping the smaller one with both hands, unwilling to set it down until the larger one has already arrived and proven itself trustworthy. But the field, according to this law, does not typically work in that sequence. The space usually has to be made first. The releasing usually has to come before the proof, not after it. The three things most commonly withheld. The teachers who worked most closely with this law over time identified three categories of things that human beings most consistently and most unconsciously refuse to release, each one blocking a different category of what they are asking to create. The first, and by the widest margin the most common, is identity. This is almost invisible to the person experiencing it, because identity does not present itself as something you are gripping. It presents itself as simply who you are, which makes the grip almost impossible to feel from the inside. But consider this. How often does the thing you are asking for require becoming a version of yourself that does not yet exist? And how often are you, at some deep and largely unexamined level, unwilling to let the current version of yourself die in order to make room for that new version? Think about this carefully, because the specific mechanics matter here. Maybe you have spent 15 years being known as the dependable one, the one who holds everything together, the one who never asks for help, never admits weakness, never lets anything slip. And that identity has provided something real, something genuinely valuable, a sense of worth earned through usefulness, a reliable source of approval, a clear story about who you are in relation to the people around you. Now imagine you want more ease in your life, more support, more room to receive care rather than always providing it. You can want that with complete sincerity and still be, at a level you have never directly examined, protecting the old identity of the tireless one. Because to let that identity go would require facing whatever the tireless one was protecting you from. And that, whatever lives underneath that particular identity, may be something your system has been avoiding for a very long time. Asking the universe for ease while refusing at the foundational level to release the identity of the person who handles everything alone is asking for a new home while standing in the old one with your hands wrapped around the doorframe. The field cannot deliver the new structure into a space still fully, completely occupied by the old one. The second category is grievance. And this one is worth approaching with particular gentleness because grievance often feels not just earned, but righteous. Someone hurt you, betrayed you, failed you in a way that mattered and in a way that had consequences. The grievance you carry as a result feels like the only fair and appropriate response to what actually happened. It feels like the least the situation owed you. But grievance held indefinitely occupies an enormous amount of interior space. Space that is genuinely unavailable for anything else. Space that could otherwise be directed toward what you're actually trying to create. This does not mean the original hurt did not matter. It does not mean what happened to you was acceptable or that the person who hurt you did not bear responsibility. It means the ongoing act of holding the grievance, replaying it, rehearsing the injustice of it, keeping the emotional charge alive in full years after the event itself has passed, is a form of energy that has been taken out of circulation, locked away, unavailable to fuel anything new. The grievance is not protecting you from anything in the present. It is simply keeping a wound open that cannot heal while you are actively preventing it from closing. The third category is the hardest to see in yourself, and it deserves the most compassion. A hidden benefit tucked inside the very problem you say you want to solve. This is sensitive territory, and I want to be careful with it, because almost no one does this on purpose. Almost no one consciously chooses to perpetuate their own difficulties. But it is remarkably common to be receiving something real from a difficulty, even while consciously and sincerely wishing it away. Think about the person who only receives genuine care and attention from the people they love when they are unwell. Some quiet part of them has learned over time, through real, repeated experience, that being healthy means being invisible, and being sick means being held. That part is not evil. That part is simply trying to make sure a genuine need gets met. But it will keep arranging for the illness to return as long as illness is the only available currency for receiving care. Think about the person whose financial struggles provide a permanent, unquestionable reason for never attempting the ambitious thing they are genuinely terrified of failing at publicly. The financial difficulty is real. The suffering it causes is genuine. But it is also serving a function, preventing exposure to a risk that feels even more unbearable than the current difficulty. Think about the person whose unresolved conflict with someone close to them provides the comfort of certainty, the clean, settled sense of having been wronged, that would evaporate the moment they genuinely examine their own part in what went wrong. None of this is weakness. None of it is moral failure. It is simply what human beings do when a protective arrangement, however imperfect, however costly, feels less dangerous than the alternative. The mind will always favor a familiar difficulty over an unfamiliar risk, even when the familiar difficulty is causing genuine pain. But the field responds to the whole picture, including the part you have not yet looked at directly. And a hidden benefit like the ones I have just described will keep quietly, efficiently winning out over a conscious desire every time, until it is finally named, brought fully into the light, and consciously examined. What is actually being asked of you? Here is where the law of sacrifice reveals itself as something far more intimate than a law about giving up possessions or comforts. In every one of the three categories I just described, identity, grievance, and hidden benefit, what is actually being asked of you is not effort in the traditional sense of the word. It is confrontation with exactly the material we have been calling shadow throughout this entire book. The identity you are protecting is protecting you from a fear you have not yet directly faced. The grievance you are holding is holding a grief you have not yet allowed yourself to fully feel. The hidden benefit you cannot quite see clearly is hidden precisely because seeing it directly would require admitting something about yourself that feels safer left in the dark. This means the law of sacrifice is not at its root a law about giving up things. It is a law about giving up protection. The old identity was protecting you from something. The grievance was protecting you from grief. The secondary gain was protecting you from vulnerability. Sacrifice, in the deepest sense the ancient traditions intended, is the willingness to set down the protection. Once you can see clearly enough to recognize that the protection itself has become the obstacle standing between you and what you are genuinely trying to create. And this is precisely why sacrifice cannot be faked, rushed, or performed as a technique the way an affirmation can be performed. You cannot pretend to release an identity while secretly, quietly still needing it to feel safe. You cannot recite a sentence about forgiveness while the grievance remains fully charged and operational underneath it. The field, as we established in the first chapter, responds to the deeper signal, not the surface performance. And sacrifice, more than perhaps any other law in this work, exposes the gap between what a person says they have released and what they have genuinely, completely, honestly let go of. The practice for this law, the practical application here follows the witnessing practice we have used throughout this book, but it applies it to a very specific and often very uncomfortable question. Take the thing you are most sincerely asking the field to bring you. The relationship, the financial shift, the health change, the creative life, the recognition, whatever it is that you keep returning to, keep hoping for, keep working toward without yet fully receiving. Now ask, as honestly as you can manage, what would I have to stop being, stop believing, or stop benefiting from in order to actually receive this? Sit with the answer without rushing past it, without editing it into something more comfortable, without judging yourself for whatever surfaces. If the honest answer is, I would have to stop being the one who handles everything alone, sit with that. Feel what that identity has given you. Feel also what it has cost you. Hold both without collapsing into either shame about the cost or defensiveness about the value. If the honest answer is, I would have to finally stop being right about what they did to me, sit with that too. Without forcing forgiveness, you do not genuinely feel. Simply naming clearly what the law is asking of you is a significant and complete act in itself. If the honest answer reveals a hidden benefit, a way you have been receiving something real from the very difficulty you claim to want solved, meet that discovery with genuine compassion rather than shame. Nearly everyone carries at least one of these hidden exchanges somewhere in their life. Finding it is not evidence of weakness. It is the exact moment this law was designed to produce. Once named, the release does not need to happen instantly. It rarely does in a single sitting, and pretending otherwise is a form of the same bypassing we discussed in the previous chapter. What changes is that the exchange is no longer happening unconsciously. You are no longer unknowingly withholding the very thing that would free the space for what you are genuinely asking to receive. You have brought it into the light, and material brought fully into conscious view, held with the non-judgmental witnessing that has run through this entire book, begins loosening its grip in a way that unconscious material simply never can. What this law ultimately asks, there is a reason this law was never meant to be separated from the law of attraction, even though the modern personal development world has effectively removed it from the conversation. The law of attraction tells you what is possible. The law of sacrifice tells you what it will actually require, not as punishment, not as arbitrary difficulty imposed by an indifferent universe, but as the simple, consistent mechanics of an energetic system that has never, in any tradition that has studied it carefully, offered something for nothing. This is not a discouraging teaching. I know it can feel that way on first encounter, but it is, in its own way, profoundly respectful of you. It assumes you are capable of more than passive wishing and hopeful visualization. It assumes you are capable of the harder, more honest work of examining what you are protecting and choosing, consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of what it costs, to set it down. Every tradition that arrived at this law arrived at the same conclusion. The life you're asking for is genuinely available. It has likely been available for longer than you realize. What has been missing is not belief. It was never effort aimed in the wrong direction. What has been missing is the willingness to complete the exchange, to make the actual release that the field has been quietly waiting for you to do. In the next chapter, we turn to the law that stands in the most direct, almost startling contrast to everything modern manifestation culture has taught you to do. We turn to the one discipline that the oldest traditions considered essential and that the modern conversation has almost entirely abandoned. The discipline of silence, and the counterintuitive, initially uncomfortable truth that the intention spoken the most is very often the intention that arrives the slowest. Chapter 4. The Law of Silence. Why what you don't say might matter more than what you do. There is a habit almost everyone who has ever seriously engaged with personal development has been taught to practice. And it is, according to the oldest teachings on this subject, one of the most quietly damaging habits a person can develop in relation to the things they most want to create. The habit is this: the moment you decide you want something, you tell people about it. You share the vision. You post about the goal. You describe the plan in detail to anyone who will listen and several people who probably will not. You articulate the feeling of already having it, the timeline you're working toward, the specific shape of the life you're building, because somewhere along the way, you absorbed the teaching that speaking a thing into existence is how things come into existence. The ancient traditions understood something almost entirely opposite to this. They understood that the intention spoken the most frequently is very often the intention that manifests the most slowly. And in many cases, it is the intention that does not fully manifest at all. This is the law of silence, and it is without question the hardest law in this book to actually practice, because it asks you to do less of the one thing that modern manifestation culture has most insistently trained you to do more of. What speaking too early actually does. To understand why this law operates the way it does, it helps to return to something we established in the very first chapter. Everything is frequency, including an intention in its earliest stage, a desire that has just formed, a new vision, a fresh ambition, a genuine sense of direction that has just come into focus, is not yet a fully developed signal. It is closer to a seedling that has just broken through the surface of the soil. It is alive, it is real, but it is fragile in a very specific way. It has not yet developed the root structure that would allow it to survive exposure to wind, to skepticism, to the weight of other people's expectations and projections. The ancient teachers held that this early, fragile stage of an intention requires a specific kind of protection. The same way a seedling requires the enclosed warmth of a greenhouse, before it is ready to be transplanted into open ground. When you speak a new intention out loud, especially to other people, especially before it has had time to develop its own internal coherence, something measurable and specific happens to the energy behind it. A portion of that energy is spent in the act of speaking itself, in the performance of describing what you want, in absorbing whatever reaction the other person offers, whether that reaction is encouraging or skeptical, or somewhere in between. The Hermetic and Vedic traditions alike describe this as a form of dissipation. The intention that might have remained concentrated, gathering strength quietly while it developed enough internal coherence to take root in reality, has instead been dispersed outward in the form of words, spent on an audience before it was ever given the chance to fully form itself. The specific trap. Inside the dissipation, there is a particular mechanism worth examining here that explains something many people have experienced but rarely understood precisely enough to actually address. Speaking about a goal, sharing it, describing it, announcing it to people who respond with interest or excitement, produces a genuine, measurable sense of satisfaction. The mind registers the social acknowledgement. It registers being seen as someone with ambition and direction. And it interprets that satisfaction as a small but real taste of the goal itself. This is not imagination. It is a well-documented psychological response, and it is precisely the problem. A small taste of satisfaction arriving before any actual work has been done quietly reduces the internal pressure that would otherwise have continued driving the intention forward. You feel, at some level below conscious awareness, slightly more finished than you actually are. And that feeling, however small, however brief, is often enough to subtly loosen the grip that would otherwise have carried the intention all the way through to completion. You shared the goal. The goal felt real for a moment. The motivation that was building dissipated into the satisfaction of having talked about it. And now you are working with a fraction of the energetic charge you started with, wondering why it feels harder to sustain than it did before you told anyone. The 3 stages every intention passes through, the teachers who worked most carefully with this law described every intention as passing through 3 distinct stages before it becomes visible in the physical world. The law of silence applies almost entirely to the first of these 3. The first stage is conception. The moment an intention first forms, still vague, still taking shape, still finding its edges, still vulnerable to being reshaped or abandoned by even a relatively small amount of outside opinion. This is the greenhouse stage. This is the stage that requires protection, not exposure. The second stage is incubation, the period during which the intention is being quietly strengthened, refined, and aligned, primarily through the interior work we have covered in the previous 3 chapters, examining the belief beneath it, noticing what it reflects, identifying what it may be asking you to release. This stage is also largely interior. It is not the time for announcement. It is the time for honest, patient, consistent inner work. The third stage is expression. The point at which the intention has gathered enough coherent internal strength that it is genuinely ready to meet the outer world, ready to be spoken, shared, and acted upon visibly without being weakened by that exposure, without losing its essential shape to the reactions of the people it encounters. The mistake the modern manifestation movement makes almost universally and almost always with good intentions is treating stage 1 as though it were already stage 3. It trains people to speak the intention immediately at its most fragile, least developed point, long before it has had the opportunity to pass through the strengthening work of genuine incubation. The equivalent, as the ancient teachers pointed out, of digging a seedling up the day after planting it to show someone what is growing. An act that does not accelerate the growth, it interrupts it. What other people's reactions actually do. There is a specific mechanism here worth examining with particular care because it explains why this law holds even when the people you are sharing your intention with are genuinely supportive, even when they love you, even when their reaction is exactly what you were hoping to receive. When you share a new intention with someone else, you are, whether either of you realizes it in the moment, inviting their consciousness into contact with something that was, until that moment, entirely contained within you. Their reaction, whatever form it takes, immediately becomes part of the energetic environment surrounding that intention. If the reaction carries doubt, even gentle, well-meaning, expressed as practical concern doubt, some trace of that doubt now lives inside the field of the intention alongside your own belief in it. It is not that their doubt is stronger than your belief. It is that the doubt is now present in a way it was not before, and your developing intention now has to find its shape in relationship to that presence as well as everything else. If the reaction carries excessive excitement, the kind that makes you feel seen and validated and celebrated, the intention now carries a subtle pressure to perform for an audience that is watching and expecting results, a pressure that did not exist when the intention was entirely your own private territory. Even entirely supportive, beautifully offered reactions introduce something that was not there before. Another person's expectations, another person's sense of what your timeline should look like, another person's need to see progress reported back to them, to know that the thing you shared with them is moving in the direction you described. This is why the ancient teachers described an intention protected in silence as retaining a kind of purity that an intention exposed too early can never fully recover, no matter how supportive the people it was shared with happen to be. It is not that other people are threats to your growth. It is that an intention still in its fragile first stage needs to remain within the container of your own consciousness until it has developed enough internal coherence and root strength to hold its shape regardless of what anyone else thinks about it. Silence as an active practice, not a passive withholding. It would be easy to read everything I have just said and conclude that this law simply means staying quiet. Default withholding, practiced out of caution. That is not what the ancient teachers meant. And the distinction matters enormously for how you actually work with this. Silence in this teaching is not the absence of speech. It is a specific, active discipline, something the Vedic tradition described as mona, a deliberate turning inward that is not merely refraining from talking, but actively conserving and concentrating energy that would otherwise be dispersed outward through speech, through explanation, through the constant narration of your interior life to whoever happens to be nearby. Practice this way, silence becomes less about restriction and more about conservation. The same principle we encountered in the previous chapter. Just as releasing an old identity makes room for something new to enter, Withholding premature speech conserves energy that would otherwise be spent before the intention was ready to use it. There is a useful way to feel the difference between these two forms of silence directly. Passive silence, the kind practiced out of fear or insecurity or a reluctance to be vulnerable, feels like tension, like something being held back against your will, like a pressure building toward an eventual release, like you are gritting your teeth through the withholding. Active silence, the kind this law is actually describing, feels calm, almost private in a pleasant way, closer to the quiet satisfaction of tending something valuable that does not yet need anyone else's approval or acknowledgement in order to continue growing. You are not keeping a secret out of fear. You are protecting something precious out of wisdom. If you notice the first kind of silence in yourself, the tense, white-knuckled, reluctant kind, that is worth examining on its own terms. It often signals a fear of being seen or a belief that your intentions need external validation to be real rather than a genuine, freely chosen practice of this law. The silence this chapter is describing is the second kind, chosen freely, maintained comfortably, practiced from a place of settled inner knowing, rather than anxious withholding. When speaking finally becomes appropriate. This law does not ask you to remain silent about your intentions indefinitely, and it is worth being very specific about what actually signals the transition from the incubation stage, where silence is protective and necessary, into the expression stage, where speaking becomes not just appropriate, but genuinely useful. The ancient teachers pointed to a specific internal marker as the sign that an intention has completed enough of its incubation to be ready for exposure. The marker is this: when you can imagine speaking the intention out loud to someone skeptical, someone who might respond with doubt, with dismissal, with a list of reasons it probably will not work, and you notice that their potential reaction no longer has the power to shake your own certainty about it, the intention has become strong enough to survive contact with the outer world. Before that point, most people, if they are genuinely honest with themselves, will notice that a doubtful reaction from someone else does still introduce a flicker of the same doubt into their own relationship with the intention, however briefly. That flicker is the signal that the intention has not yet completed its incubation, that speaking it now would still risk the dissipation the law warns against. Once that flicker is genuinely gone, once the intention lives in you as something settled, something you hold with quiet, unmovable certainty regardless of who agrees with you, speaking about it no longer weakens it. At that stage, in fact, speaking about it can become genuinely useful, inviting the practical support, resources, and collaboration that a fully formed intention often needs in order to make the transition from inner reality to outer form. This is the nuance the ancient teaching insisted on, and the modern version almost entirely lost. Silence is not the permanent condition. It is the necessary first condition, honored fully and patiently before speech is invited in. Why this law belongs in a book about shadow work. There is a specific reason this law belongs here, alongside the laws of vibration, reflection, and sacrifice, and it connects directly to something we established in the second chapter. If the people around you function as mirrors, reflecting back to you with precision and consistency material you have not yet fully brought into conscious view, then speaking a fragile new intention too early does something that is easy to overlook. It exposes that intention to reflection before it has had the chance to become clear even to yourself. Imagine sharing a new ambition with someone whose own unresolved material causes them to respond with subtle discouragement, perhaps disguised as realistic concern, perhaps disguised as practical caution, perhaps offered with complete sincerity and genuine love. If your own intention is still in its earliest, most fragile stage, their response can become tangled with your own uncertainty in a way that is genuinely difficult to separate afterward. You may walk away from that conversation less clear about your own desire than you were before you spoke it, having absorbed a reflection that was never actually about you at all, but about whatever unresolved fear or grief happened to be living in the person you told. Protecting an intention in silence during its earliest stage is, among other things, a way of protecting it from becoming entangled in someone else's shadow before it has had the chance to fully become your own. The practice for this law. The practice here is simple to describe and, for most people, genuinely difficult to sustain, precisely because it runs so directly counter to the habits that modern life has trained into almost all of us. The next time a new intention forms in you, something you want to create, to change, to become, notice the immediate pull to tell someone. Notice how quickly that impulse arrives. Notice how automatic it feels, how completely normal and harmless it presents itself as. Instead of following that impulse immediately, let the intention remain unspoken for a deliberate period of time that you set in advance, long enough to feel a little uncomfortable, long enough to actually test something. During that period, direct the energy you would have spent speaking about the intention into the interior work this book has already outlined. Examine the belief beneath it, using the practice from the first chapter. Notice what it is reflecting back to you, using the practice from the second chapter. Identify what it may be asking you to release, using the practice from the third chapter. Let the intention grow in this protected interior space, strengthening through honest examination rather than through announcement. When the period you set has passed, check for the marker described earlier. Has the intention become settled enough that a doubtful reaction from someone skeptical would no longer shake it? If not, extend the silence further. If so, you may now speak it, not because an arbitrary time limit has been fulfilled, but because the intention itself has finally become strong enough to meet the outer world without losing anything essential in the exchange. The deepest reason for this law. There is a final layer to this teaching that I want to sit with before we close this chapter, because it connects everything we have covered so far in a way that I find genuinely moving. Silence practiced the way this chapter describes is not simply a technique for protecting the strength of an intention. It is also, quietly, a return to the same witnessing consciousness this entire book began with. In the space where you would ordinarily speak, explain, seek reaction, gather validation, silence asks you instead to simply be with your own intention, undistracted by anyone else's response to it, meeting it the same way you were asked in Chapter 1 to meet your own buried beliefs, the same way you were asked in Chapter 2 to meet your own disproportionate reactions, the same way you were asked in Chapter 3 to meet your own hidden benefits, directly, honestly, without needing anyone else's presence in order for it to feel real. An intention that can exist fully, that you can hold with complete certainty and settled peace, without ever once needing to be spoken aloud for validation, has already demonstrated something that no amount of external manifestation can substitute for. It has demonstrated that you trust yourself, that you do not require the outer world's acknowledgement to know that what you are building within yourself is genuinely real. That is, in its own quiet way, one of the most powerful things available to a human being. Chapter 5. The Law of Perpetual Transmutation. Nothing you have carried was ever wasted. There is a question that follows a person through every chapter of this book, even when it is never asked directly. If I release the old identity, if I finally set down the grievance, if I stop receiving the hidden benefit from the very problem I say I want solved, where does all of that go? It cannot simply disappear. Nothing you have felt, believed, built your entire sense of safety around for years at a time vanishes the moment you decide to stop holding it. So what actually happens to it? The ancient Hermetic tradition answered this question directly through what it called the principle of perpetual transmutation. And it is, in many ways, the quiet foundation underneath everything else this book has asked you to do. The law beneath the laws. The principle that makes sense of all the others. The principle states simply that energy is never destroyed. It is only ever converted from one form into another. Endlessly. Without exception, at every level of existence anyone has ever managed to look at closely enough to understand. Nothing you release is ever lost. It is transformed. And understanding exactly how that transformation works and what it produces is what finally makes full sense of the 4 chapters that came before this one. The law beneath the other laws. Let me show you how this principle has been quietly present in every chapter of this book, doing its work underneath the surface, even though we have not named it directly until now. When we discussed the law of vibration, we said that changing a belief is not a matter of deleting the old one and installing a new one. You cannot erase a belief the way you might delete a file. What you can do is convert it. Take the raw energy that has been running as I am not worthy of this, the charge, the frequency, the force of it, and through the patient, honest process of witnessing and gathering contradicting evidence, gradually transmute that same energy into, I have begun to prove otherwise. The charge does not disappear. It changes form. When we discuss the law of reflection, we describe the intensity of your reaction to another person as a signal pointing toward buried material. That buried material, the old grief about your own silenced confidence, the old shame about a quality you learned to hide, is itself a form of stored energy, held in place sometimes for decades, waiting for the moment it is finally seen clearly enough to move. When you finally see it and let it move, it does not evaporate into nothing. It converts. Grief that has been witnessed fully tends to become a very specific kind of compassion, both for yourself and, remarkably often, for whoever first introduced you to the wound. Shame witnessed fully tends to become a quiet, hard-won form of self-acceptance that could not have arrived any other way. When we discussed the law of sacrifice, we said that the exchange is always fair, though rarely visible in advance. This chapter is where that exchange becomes visible. The old identity you released did not go nowhere. It became, through the process we are about to examine in detail, the very energy that now animates the new identity standing in its place. Nothing was thrown away. Everything was converted. The loss was never a loss. It was always a transformation. And when we discussed the law of silence, we described an intention gathering strength in the protected space of interior silence before it is ready to meet the world. That gathering, that quiet, invisible incubation, is itself a form of transmutation. Raw, unformed potential being slowly, patiently converted into something coherent enough and strong enough to survive contact with reality. Every law in this book has been describing transmutation from a different angle. This chapter simply gives the entire process its true name. Why nothing can be destroyed. The Hermetic teachers who first articulated this principle were not speaking metaphorically. They understood it as a literal description of how the universe at every scale is actually built. And modern physics, arriving thousands of years later, confirmed the same underlying structure through what it calls the law of conservation of energy. Energy is never created and never destroyed. It only ever changes form. The total amount within any closed system remains constant. It only converts. The ancient traditions extended this principle beyond the physical world and applied it with equal confidence to the emotional and psychological dimensions of a human life. And the implications of that extension are, I think, among the most important and least examined ideas in this entire book. The rage you suppressed for years has not disappeared simply because you stopped expressing it. It has converted, usually, into something quieter and, in many cases, more corrosive. Chronic physical tension, unexplained fatigue, a persistent low-level irritability that seems to have no clear source and no satisfying solution. The grief you refused to feel at the time it would have been appropriate to feel it did not go away when you moved on. It converted, often into a flatness that shows up years later in situations that should have moved you and somehow did not. A numbness you cannot quite explain. An emotional distance from your own life that has always seemed slightly mysterious. The fear you decided to simply override through willpower and forward momentum did not dissolve. It converted, often into the very anxiety or control issues or physical symptoms you have been trying to address ever since. This is not punishment. It is simply the law operating exactly as it always operates, faithfully, without preference, without exception. Energy denied a conscious form finds an unconscious one. It does not cease to exist simply because you have refused to acknowledge it. It simply finds a different container. This is, I think, the most sobering implication of this entire book. You cannot suppress your way into freedom. You cannot decide that a feeling is inconvenient and expect the underlying energy to quietly agree to disappear. It will find another form, almost always a form less useful and less within your conscious control than the one you refused to give it when it was first asking to be felt. The only real choice this law gives you is not whether the energy transforms. It always will, with or without your participation. The only real choice is whether you participate consciously in that transformation or leave it to happen in the dark, shaped by whatever unconscious pattern happens to be nearest at hand. The alchemist's model. The medieval alchemists who inherited the Hermetic tradition directly and spent centuries working with it, refining it, testing it in every way available to them, used an image that has survived for exactly as long as it has because it is both simple enough to remember and precise enough to actually guide the work. They spoke of turning lead into gold, and while later, more literal-minded interpreters took this as a claim about metallurgy, The alchemists who actually understood the tradition knew it was never about metal at all. Lead was their word for dense, heavy, unrefined material, the raw, base emotional and psychological substance every human being carries. Shame, fear, grief, rage, all the material this book has been asking you, chapter by chapter, to finally look at directly rather than explain away or suppress or bypass with a concept that sounds sophisticated but does not actually change anything. Gold was their word for that same material, fully transmuted, refined through deliberate, patient, honest attention into something of genuine value, wisdom, compassion, groundedness. The particular kind of courage that only exists in a person who has already faced the thing they were most afraid of and discovered on the other side of it that they were still standing. What made this teaching radical, and what makes it radical still, is the insistence that gold cannot be manufactured any other way. You cannot produce genuine wisdom without having first possessed something raw enough to be transmuted into it. You cannot arrive at real compassion for another person's failure without having once faced and transformed the same failure quietly, honestly, within yourself. You cannot develop the specific kind of groundedness that other people feel when they are near you, the kind that has actual weight, actual substance, without having stood in the fire long enough for something fundamental to be converted. This means the very material you have spent the largest portion of your life trying to hide, to minimize, to keep safely out of sight. The shame you would never say out loud, the grief you have never let anyone fully witness you feeling, is not an obstacle standing between you and the life you are trying to build. It is the only substance from which that life, in its fullest and most genuinely valuable form, could ever actually be made. How the conversion actually happens. It is worth being precise about the mechanism here, because this is where most modern spiritual teaching becomes vague in ways the ancient traditions never were. And the vagueness does real damage because it leads people to attempt the conversion without actually performing it, and then to conclude that it does not work when the unconverted material continues operating underneath. The conversion is not accomplished by thinking positively about the wound. Positive thinking applied to unprocessed material does not convert it. It layers language on top of it. The material continues operating beneath the layer of language, just as we established in the very first chapter. It is not accomplished by forcing gratitude onto a feeling that has not yet been fully felt. Gratitude arrived at by skipping over the underlying emotion is not genuine gratitude. It is performed gratitude, which the field, as we have consistently established, distinguishes from the real thing with perfect accuracy. The actual mechanism, consistent across every tradition that has preserved this teaching with any genuine depth, has 3 parts, and you have technically practiced all 3 of them in the earlier chapters of this book, though we have not named them this particular way until now. The first part is full contact, not glancing at the wound from a comfortable intellectual distance, not analyzing it from above, actually feeling it completely, in the body, with your full attention for as long as it genuinely needs to move through rather than around it. This is what we were asking for in the second chapter when we described sitting with the charge of a disproportionate reaction rather than immediately explaining it away. The same full contact applied now to the underlying material the charge was pointing toward. The second part is non-identification. The same witnessing discipline that has run as a thread through every chapter of this book. You are present with the wound fully, completely, without flinching. But you do not become the wound. You hold it the way a well-made container holds a fire, close enough to receive its heat, structured enough not to be consumed by it. This is the distinction between transmutation and simple re-traumatization. Without this second part, without the witnessing presence that remains stable while the feeling moves through it, full contact with an old wound can simply reopen it painfully, repeatedly, without any conversion taking place. The same territory is covered again and again without any genuine movement occurring. With it, the same contact becomes the fire the alchemists were describing, the container that allows the material to actually transform rather than simply resurface. The third part is time. And this is the part that modern culture, addicted to instantaneous results, trained to expect overnight transformation, most strongly resists. It is worth being direct about it so that its absence is not mistaken for failure on your part. Transmutation, in every tradition that has ever described it honestly, is not instantaneous. Lead does not become gold in a single afternoon, however sincere the attempt. The material you have been carrying for 20 years may require sustained, repeated, patient attention, returned to again and again without forcing it to be finished before it actually is, before its genuine conversion completes. This is not a sign that the process has failed. It is simply the honest time scale the ancient traditions consistently attached to this work. They never pretended it was faster than it actually is, and I think that honesty, however uncomfortable, is itself a form of respect for you and for the genuine difficulty of what you are undertaking. What the gold actually looks like. It is worth being concrete here, because the word gold can sound abstract enough to become meaningless. And what this process actually produces in a human life is specific enough to be worth describing precisely. The gold that results from this process rarely announces itself dramatically. It does not arrive in a single transformative moment that you will remember forever as the turning point. It tends to appear quietly, noticed, only in retrospect, usually in a moment when you would once have reacted from the old material, and find almost to your own surprise that you no longer do. The person whose confidence once provoked a sharp, disproportionate flash of something uncomfortable now simply registers as someone confident. Nothing more. The old charge is no longer attached. The quality no longer touches anything tender, because what it was touching has been genuinely converted rather than simply suppressed or bypassed. The grievance that used to occupy hours of replayed internal conversation now surfaces occasionally, briefly, without the consuming pull it once carried. It is not that the original event no longer matters. It is that the energy you were pouring into it has been genuinely converted into something that actually serves you. The identity that once required constant defending, the reliable one, the competent one, the one who never needs help, has quietly loosened its grip. What has replaced it is something steadier and less brittle, less dependent on being perceived in a particular way in order to feel like yourself, more genuinely at ease in a wider range of circumstances, including the ones where you used to feel most exposed. This is what the ancient traditions meant when they described the completed transmutation, not the absence of the original material, not the erasure of the wound or the pretense that it never existed, but its full, genuine conversion into something the person can actually use, something that has real weight, real substance, real value in a human life. The shame that once needed to be hidden became, through years of honest and patient attention, the specific compassion you now offer without effort to someone else going through exactly what you once kept secret. The grief that once felt too large to survive became the depth you now carry, the quality that allows you to actually be present with another person's pain rather than managing it from a safe distance. The fear that once organized your entire life around its avoidance became the particular kind of courage available only to someone who has already walked into the thing they were most afraid of and discovered that they were, on the other side of it, still entirely themselves. Nothing was wasted. Not one moment of difficulty this book has asked you to look at directly. Not one uncomfortable truth. Not one moment of sitting with something painful when every instinct was pointing toward looking away. All of it was always already the raw material. All of it was always already the lid that was waiting patiently for the fire. The wholeness. This points toward there is a final understanding embedded in this law that brings the entire book to its true close. And I want to offer it carefully, because it is easy to hear it as a platitude when it is actually a precise description. If nothing is ever destroyed, only converted, then there is no part of you, however long hidden, however heavily layered in shame, however carefully kept out of sight for years or decades, that exists outside the possibility of becoming something of genuine value. This is not comfort offered to soften difficult material. It is, according to every tradition this book has drawn from, an accurate description of how the process actually functions. You were never broken, requiring parts of yourself to be removed before you could be considered whole. You were never defective, requiring a better version of yourself to be installed in place of the current one. You were, from the very beginning, underneath everything, whole in exactly the way a piece of ore is whole before it has been refined, carrying within it already everything necessary for the gold it will eventually become, requiring not addition, not replacement, but the one thing this book has been offering from the very first page, the fire of conscious, sustained, honest attention. What this book has asked of you across every law we have examined, vibration, reflection, sacrifice, silence, transmutation, was never to become someone different from who you actually are. It was to bring what you already are, all of it, including the parts you have spent the longest keeping hidden, into the one condition capable of completing the conversion: conscious attention, sustained presence, unflinching honesty about what is actually there. That is the fire. You have been standing beside it throughout this entire book. The only question that remains, now that every law has been named and every practice has been described, is whether you are finally ready to step fully in. The architecture you have been living inside. We began this book with a single honest acknowledgement. You have asked for things before, and some of them came, and some of them never did, and you were never fully given the actual reason why. Now you have it. Not one law pulled from context and sold as the entire system. The full architecture, every piece of it, in the order it was always meant to be understood. The frequency that was always speaking louder than your words. The signal beneath the signal. The belief running underneath the affirmation, the real broadcast that the field was always responding to rather than the performance layered on top of it. The mirrors that have been standing in front of you the entire time, every disproportionate reaction, every intense admiration, every person who presses the same specific tender place again and again, all of it showing you with extraordinary precision exactly where your growth is currently located, the exchange that has been quietly waiting to be completed, the identity, the grievance, the hidden benefit held with both hands, blocking the very space you keep asking to be filled, the silence that protects what is still too fragile to survive exposure, the protected interior space where an intention develops the root structure it needs before it is asked to survive contact with the outer world. And beneath all four, running underneath everything, making sense of everything, the oldest law of all, the one that promises without reservation, without exception, that nothing you have ever felt, ever carried, ever hidden from the people who love you was ever wasted. It was only ever waiting for the fire. What happens next? None of this was ever meant to remain information. A law you understand and never apply is simply a beautiful concept you carry alongside all your unexamined patterns, changing nothing. A law you actually live with, that you return to again and again, that you bring to the specific moments of your actual life rather than to some imagined future moment when you will finally be ready, becomes something else entirely. It becomes the way you move through a life that finally makes sense to you, not because the difficulty disappears, but because you understand with a clarity most people never fully reach exactly what the difficulty has always been trying to give you. You did not find this by accident. Some part of you, a part that has been ready for this for longer than you probably realize, recognized something true the moment you started. That part already knows what happens next. It is not a dramatic transformation arriving all at once announced by fanfare. It is quieter than that, and far more durable than that. It is the next moment of disproportionate charge, you notice, and choose consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of what you are doing, to sit with instead of explaining away. It is the next old identity you finally release, trusting the exchange before you have any proof it will be honored, because you now understand the architecture well enough to trust the law. It is the next intention you protect in silence long enough to let it develop the root structure it needs to survive becoming real. One honest moment at a time, one conscious choice at a time, one small deliberate act of bringing something into the fire of your own clear attention instead of leaving it to operate in the dark. The gold this book has described was never somewhere else waiting to be found. It was always here, in you, in exactly the material you have spent the longest looking away from. All it has ever been waiting for is the fire, and now you know where it is. One law, this week. If this found you at the right moment, and I believe it did, the most powerful thing you can do right now is not move immediately to the next thing waiting for your attention. It is to choose one law from this book, just one, and actually apply it this week in a specific situation, with a specific intention, with the honest, patient attention this work requires. Pick the law that unsettled you most while you were reading. That discomfort is not random. It is almost always the clearest signal of exactly where your own work is waiting. If this resonated in the way I hope it did, subscribe to this channel, because This is one piece of a much larger body of work being built here. One law and one practice and one honest conversation at a time. And if you know someone who has been circling the same pattern for years, wondering why nothing seems to shift no matter how much effort they bring to it, share this with them. Not because they need fixing, because, like you, they are simply ready to finally understand the architecture they have been living inside the whole time. Thank you for spending this time here. I will see you in the next one.